So friends, Professor Payal Nagpal has already introduced the idea of communication between the snake and the poet, and she has also referred very meaningfully to modernism. And modernism, would always look at suspicion, at these things with suspicion, and will question and reject and somehow, put the other idea in dock. And there is a kind of alienation of the human being from his or her surroundings, and that alienation can't be, overcome. So all those things are there in modernism, but then Professor Payal Nagpal has, brought the dimension of exchange of glances and that communication that I talk of. And let's now, I'm curious to know more about Professor Payal Nagpal's response to the poem. And it's a long poem. It's a poem, that goes up to 76 lines, as we are told. So I request her to resume the discussion and make the points further.
Yes, thank you, Professor Prakash. Like we were discussing that the poet considers, I think what is relevant here is the poet's consideration of himself as the second comer, and also his decision to wait. So one would normally, if one has gone to fill water at a trough and one sees something, it could be I'm not just a snake, but any kind of organism, the immediate response would be to just take it and put it aside, throw it away, so that you can fill water. So indicating that it's humans who have that first right. But here, the care with which the image of the snake is built up, and as mentioned earlier, almost like he's a guest who has come to the poet's house, which is the water trough here, and the poet considers himself to be the second comer and waits. So to quote from the poem, he lifted his head from his drinking as cattle do, and looked at me vaguely, as drinking cattle do, and flickered his two-forked tongue from his lips and mused a moment. I think here we need to pause and also ask another question, because it appears as if Lawrence is doing this deliberately. He lifts his head from the drinking as cattle do, so which gives cattle the right to drink, and there is a set image of when the cattle looks at the human being who's there at the water trough. But does the snake have the same right as the cattle does to this water is almost a question that he is asking. So where the poet is suggesting that the snake has as much right to the water as cattle do, and pretty much as human beings do. So, and flickered his two-forked tongue. So I think the two-forked tongue immediately would bring in a long history, in a sense, of the way in which the snake is kind of understood. So right from the biblical tradition to, as Professor Prakash pointed out, the representation of the serpent and Satan in Milton's Paradise Lost. So, but what Lawrence is suggesting here is that this snake, with his two-forked tongue, has as much right to the water as the cattle, or as he himself who's standing there. So the snake stoops and he drinks the water, being earth brown, earth golden from the burning bowels of the earth. And on the day of Sicilian July, with Etna smoking, reference of course to Mount Etna, and the indication being that this was probably written while he was in Sicily. So he says, and this is now the turning point. So the beauty of the snake, the process with which he moves to the water trough, the comparison with cattle, and that is very, very interesting, because the snake is known to be venomous, but the cattle is always considered to be innocent. So here the two are juxtaposed as being on the same side. So a turning point in the poem, he says, "The voice of my education said to me, he must be killed. For in Sicily, the black snakes are innocent, the gold are venomous." And voices in me said, if you were a man, you would take a stick and break him now and finish him off. So, if we were to just unpack these lines, the voice of education, first and foremost, says that the snake should be killed. Why? Because we have to be practical. So, and also it's very clear because a lot of care has been taken in the first part of the poem to highlight the color of the snake, because this is a gold snake, it is not a black snake. And the black ones are innocent, but the gold one here is venomous. And so he says that to be a man, what does it really speaking mean to be a man? To be a man means to assert yourself and to take that stick and finish off the snake. So this brings us to the question, what does the snake represent then? The snake also represents a certain kind of sexuality. And in a sense, that particular instinct is to be done away with. And education, has also created certain kinds of stereotypes. So the man is supposed to kill the snake and adhere to the stereotypes that have been created. Over to you.
No,
Professor
actually,
Prakash, on this.
this is a new dimension, and I think this is worth exploring. That sexuality in human behavior is a representation of the natural impulse, and if that natural impulse stands against the faculty of reasoning, and the reasoning should control all those things, and then finally be a human being, be a man. Therefore, in a way, it is suggesting that humans have taken upon themselves the responsibility to rule their kingdom, to rule their environment, and to put everything second. And in the previous part of the poem discussion, you referred to the hierarchy, and the animals come first, the cattle come first, and the human beings come later, or at least equal. So that was the question. But then the reason in the human being perhaps is the enemy, not just of nature, but of the person himself. So in a way, he is criticizing that faculty of reason, which is denoted by the use of the word education. And education is a very heavy word in the poem, surrounded by all the soft implications of life and experience in the poem so far. We certainly have this word education. So education means that human beings have been taken away from the scene completely, and nature is not education. Nature is flow, nature is spontaneity. And when you have education, then you have that faculty controlling your whole behavior. So I think this is the point in the poem where things are being problematized in the contemporary context.
Yes, which is why I refer to it as a turning point in the poem, where he says, the voice of my education. Now, there is another aspect to it, which is that education, I think here is, not just reason, but and not just about evolution, but it's also about the way in which so-called civilized society has trained the mind. And for him, that training has taken the human being away from the primal, in a sense, from the initial impulse. If we were to actually just read these lines without this phrase, if you were a man. So, for instance, the line goes like this, and voices in me said, if you were a man, you would take a stick and break him now and finish him off. But he could have simply said, and voices in me said, you would take a stick and break him now and finish him off. But the introduction of this phrase, if you were a man, is very significant, because it is about, the whole notion that your own sexuality too has to adhere to the stereotype that society has created. So the snake is really speaking, venomous, and that is what you have to kill. Going back to the previous discussion, so the idea was, my point was not so much about the cattle and the snake and the human beings being together, but they have all evolved differently. And of course, human beings being the Homo sapiens sapien is really speaking at the top of the pyramid when it comes to evolution. But the fact that because human beings are at the top, so does it give them the right to get that chance over the animals, is the question I think that he's raising, and is not really speaking kind of saying that, at least in the first part, this is not what he's saying. It's only with voice of my education that things change. But in the first part, I think he's accepting the snake as a guest, and the comparison, of course, with the cattle, I found to be very interesting because, one signifies a certain kind of innocence, whereas when we look at the snake, it's always equated with venom and poison, and of course, biblically, it is the evil. So, however, he says whatever is there in nature too has access and a right. So, he would wait for the snake, in a sense, to finish drinking the water, and he would wait for his turn to fill the pitcher, is the point. But what does the word education mean? It's a loaded word. What does it indicate? Is it simply education? Is it modernity? Is it civilization? So we need to kind of read the poem closely a little more to find answers to this question. So, moving on further. So, despite what this voice within the poet says, he says, "But must I confess how I liked him? How glad I was he had come like a guest in quiet to drink at my water trough, and depart peaceful, pacified, and thankless into the burning bowels of this earth." So, of course, the snake, after having the water, would move peacefully and pacified because he's had the water, and thankless. Thankless because he does not follow the logic of the civilized world, and so he has the snake. It's almost as if the snake has a right to that water. He's going to have it and move back into the earth. So he wonders and he asks himself, was it cowardice that I dared not kill him? Was it perversity that I longed to talk to him? Was it humility to feel so honored? I felt so honored, says Lawrence. So this brings in so many layers. So the whole idea of cowardice is probably related to the idea of manhood, something that we see in the earlier poem Piano also. So he says that, was he a coward that he dared not kill the snake? Because, obviously one is not going to look at a snake and go very close. Or was it perversity, he says, and here again, this is also loaded in terms of a sexual reference. So, was it humility to feel honored, he asks. Why does he feel honored? Is the question that we need to ask. And he says that he felt so honored. Why did he feel honored? So here is somebody, the animal from the wild, who has come into his space, so to say, and the poet is giving that space. He's creating within his so-called civilized life, he's creating that space where he's allowing the serpent to come in. So, and he says, yet those voices. So there are two parts now. There are two parts to the poet's psyche. One that is totally mesmerized, as I said, by the snake, and he feels honored looking at the snake. And then there is the other part, that is the voices within that tell him that if he was not afraid, he would have certainly killed the snake. And he says, yes, of course, I was afraid. I was most afraid. But he says, more than fear, what the emotion that he felt was that of honor, that the snake sought his hospitality, to quote, that he should seek my hospitality from out the dark door of the secret earth. So I think there is also this continual reference to the secret earth, to the bowels of the earth, indicating that the snake's home, in a sense, is within the bowels of the earth, whereas man's space is on the earth, not, really speaking, inside the bowels. And so from his space, the snake has come to the space of the poet, and that he considers to be an honor. Professor Prakash?
I would say that in the poem you have the 19th century debate about, enlightenment, about light on one side, which is human, and darkness, which is full of possibilities, which is romanticism. And Lawrence, carries that particular weight of the burden of the tradition on his strong shoulders, and he's telling us that there is a lot that is to be learned from darkness, from something which is hidden in the bowels of the earth, and that only a fraction of that thing is shown by the light. So I believe he's expanding the scope of the poem, and he's making it much more human in your terms that you towards the end of the point pointed out, that there is something inside us, there is something in our own body, in the own earth of our being, and that is where the snake lives. That's where the snake sometimes escapes, comes out of, to tell us that he's a guest, and he should be a matter of honor for us to receive him, and receiving him is actually receiving the self of the human being. So it's a, and the word cowardly also is to be very cleverly used by the poet, that if one can't face oneself and one's own inner nature, then one is a coward, and it is education that has turned a person into a coward. So it's a very, as you rightly said, it's a multi-layered poem and says so many things about the snake and the symbol of the snake.
Absolutely right in pointing out that ultimately the snake at one level, there are many ways, as I said, I think each decade has responded very differently to the way in which this poem is interpreted. So of course there is the whole psychoanalytical view of the snake actually being one's suppressed aspects and one's suppressed psyche in a sense, and at the same time the snake representing almost like the primal instinct, and yet the snake also represents maybe the dark side, something that we are not willing to accept. But to be that to be human in a sense is to accept both the aspect of light and the aspect of darkness, because they go hand in hand. And who else but to make mistakes and so on, but the human, right? So but here again I think the emphasis should probably be on the snake representing certain instincts that have also been suppressed by civilized society, something that spontaneity that we were talking about, that if the snake comes from nature, then he represents spontaneity, there is a flow. So all these aspects, the whole idea of spontaneity is what, according to Lawrence, has been curbed by modern society. So if we discuss this further, so there is a beautiful description that follows these lines about the snake and the way he lifts his head dreamily as one who has drunken, and how he flicks his tongue on the air and seems to lick his lips, and and at one point he's compared to God, so, and looked around like a god, unseeing into the air. So here I think Lawrence is deliberately totally inverting the myth, and at the same time is reminding us about how much the snake is a part of our lives, as it is part of nature, the entire ecological balance, really speaking. So as a snake slowly turns his head and proceeds to draw his slow length, curving round, and climb again the broken bank of my wall face. So I think here the interpretation about the snake representing a part of the human psyche that we have somewhere killed, I think that is restored, because the snake climbs again, not just the wall, not a broken bank, but the broken bank of my wall face, says the poet. So I think Lawrence has here merged, really speaking, the speaker with the snake, because the snake is now, climbing almost as if entering the psyche, really speaking of the poet. So, and as he put his head into the dreadful hole and drew up, he goes further. Now, here again, there is a sense of fear, there is a sense of horror now. As I said, that in this, it's a 74-line poem. So there are different movements. So now there is a sense of horror and protest. as against his withdrawing into a horrid black hole. So the horror in the protest is not about the presence of the snake, but about its going away, about its moving. And so he looks around, and he wonders what is to be done. Overcame me now. So he says, as the snake moves back, and he wonders how this sense of horror is there, and he looks around and he puts down the pitcher and picks up a log, and he threw it at the water trough with a clatter. I think it did not hit him, he says, but suddenly that part of him that was left behind convulsed in an undignified haste. So the snake leaves a part of part of its body is left behind, and of course it grows and he moves away. So the part that is left behind convulsed and right like lightning, and he was then gone into the black hole, the earth-lipped fissure in the wall front, at which in the intense still noon I stared with fascination. And once this act of throwing what he calls the clumsy log at the snake is complete, he regrets it. He says, I immediately regretted it. I thought, how paltry, how vulgar, what a mean act. And we come back to the point of education when he says, I despised myself and the voices of my accursed human education. So here, what is to be asked is, what does he mean by human education? Is he, again, the question that one raised with the piano, that is he suggesting a movement, there is some sense of nostalgia for the past, or is he using that to remind us of something that we might be missing in human education, and which is about, at one level, of course, there are speciology theories today, which is about acceptance of wildlife, but a very important aspect is also how we also need to accept this part of ourselves that comes from the bowels of the earth. And this reminds him of the albatross. And, of course, the reference is to Coleridge's poem, The Ancient Mariner. So, and he says, how I wish he would come back, my snake. So, here again, if, you could comment specially on this line, I despised myself and the voices of my accursed human education.
So, well, I think he has turned the idea of education upside down, and that education is now telling him about his own weaknesses, about his own lapses, and that kind of education is, I think, very useful, because if education tells you that you have to be critical of yourself and you're clumsy, and that log that was thrown at it actually was an act of cowardice. If all this is said, then education, I think, has in a way served its purpose. Now the person has become self-aware. But I would like you to, towards the end of the discussion, also talk about industrialization, which you started with. That this kind of industry and the spread of it was actually behind the experiences of the writer, and that he always viewed industrialization as a kind of evil, and that also seems to be criticized in this poem. What do you say?
Yes, so I think that is something that I began with, that when we talk about human education in a sense, now for here I think we need to also position Lawrence as a writer who comes from the working class, and he had immediate access in a sense to the mining colony where he grew up. I think that immediately kind of tells us that the industrialized world, with its emphasis on middle class living and upper class living, tells us, I think Lawrence is clearly telling us that there is something hugely deficient in this style of living. And if we look at it from the class perspective, then what is to be learned is probably, it is from the working class. That is where the spontaneity lies. That is where the life lies. So I think reason in that sense, he is very critical of industrialization, because it has taken away that spontaneity, it has taken away that it has given us reason, and reason is important. But how we apply that reason and how we execute it in our real day-to-day life, I think that is an important part here. which is where I think the connection, it immediately beautifully ties up. He's throwing the clumsy log with the, albatross. I think the connections are very, very clear. So, and he wishes, he says, I wish he would come back, my snake. Now it has become my snake. So I think the reference is, again, my becomes loaded here, because the reference is not just to the snake who has come to his home, but also something, there is a sense of loss. And he hopes that that sense of loss is kind of, taken, is filled in a sense. So he says, for he seemed to me again like a king. So we see that the snake has been compared with God, the snake has been compared with the king. And he calls him a king in exile, uncrowned in the underworld, now due to be crowned again. So he is a king in exile because even in the underworld, he has not been crowned. And, so he says that he missed his chance of one of the lords of life. And and he says, the last is, and I have something to expiate, a pettiness. So this act of, at one level, it is a simple act of throwing a log at the snake. And at that level, I think the idea is of human beings' complete rejection of wildlife, because this whole idea of speciology theory and posthumanism is looking at this particular aspect today. But more importantly, I think the log is thrown at a part of oneself, and he is only eager to embrace, this aspect that the snake represents, of the wild, of spontaneity, and so on. And I think most importantly in this poem, industrialization has somewhere numbed the senses of the people, and they have lost the capacity, they have reason, rationality, but there is something that is missing here. And this is within Lawrence's framework of things. We might have a different opinion on it, but within Lawrence's framework of things, reason and rationality have taken something away from human beings. And to acknowledge the snake and to crown the snake once again means, a kind of restoration of that basic human impulse that has probably been crushed. So, here I think I would just like to share two very different points of view to this particular poem. So, one of the critics talks about the escape of meaning here, and there is a very important critic who talks about how snake shows that when we encounter a wild creature and appreciate its value, we allow ourselves to commune with something sublime and to feel the divine, which Lawrence conveys by enthralling his reader through the detailed sense experiences that are there. And he contends that, this, he says, the poem is a prescient forerunner of what he calls extinction poets and extinction poetry. So, with this, I think we kind of come to a close, and this particular aspect is important because it tells us that yet again in the 21st century this poem is being looked at from an entirely new perspective, which is of extinction poetry.
Well, friends, the poem starts in the 1920s, and we are once again in the centuries, new centuries, 20s, and 100 years are important for the poem to survive. Not just survive, but as Professor Payal Nagpal would say, it prospers. It becomes more meaningful. And with this note of positive nature, we come to the close of the discussion. And I hope you'd review the poem from this angle that Professor Payal Nagpal presented for us. So with that, we finally close the discussion. Thank you.